Okay, thank you, Samin. And now for our next talk, I want to warmly welcome Mukovhe Masutha, who obtained a PhD in higher education management from the University of Bath. And he is currently a postdoctoral fellow in higher education funding policy at the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg, where he is also the executive director of the Center for Emerging Researchers. Mukovhe also has a remarkable profile of social and political activism. So we are really excited to hear his talk. So Mukovhe, if you wanted to share your screen.
There we go.
Yeah, that's great. We can all see it.
Okay, perfect. Good morning. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity as well. In this presentation, I will explore experiences of Black working class students in South African universities, and specifically how financial aid funded Black working class students and faculty members narrate such experiences in relation to the attainment gap that continues to persist in post-apartheid South Africa. And given the limited time, I'll really race through the background so that we can all get to participants' narrative accounts and their implications for how we understand class and racial inequity in higher education specifically. Now, as a way of background, in his analysis of UK higher education in the past 50 years, Professor Roger Brown details how through principles of marketization, competition, and meritocracy, which are key tenets of neoliberalism, universities have been repurposed towards producing exploitable knowledge and credentialed graduates. So as universities market themselves in competition with each other, and university students are reimagined as consumers, the educational attainment gap has widened along class and racial lines. I find that although Brown's primarily focuses on British universities, his findings and implications do transcend the UK. But perhaps more importantly, alongside this narrow repurposing of higher education, a post-racial, colorblind, and equal opportunity master narrative has emerged and remains very dominant. And so while the presence of students from all walks of life on our campuses is celebrated, capitalized on, and even beamed to project universities as inclusive spaces, inequality of access, experiences, and even outcomes in our universities continues to persist. And I guess the debate around the UK race report kind of reminds us that some amongst us remain reluctant, one, to recognize race as a legitimate object of scrutiny, either in policy or scholarship, and two, to recognize universities as institutions that are also active in the reproducing and perpetuating of racial inequality in different contexts. But it is important for me to stress that the neoliberal meritocracy and colorblindness narrative has not gone unchallenged. In fact, in opposition to meritocracy's notion of this ladder of educational opportunity, Joe Littler argues strongly that meritocracy actually conjures up the idea of a level playing field whilst not being one. In other words, the promises of social mobility and equal opportunity are made alongside a very strong and firm commitment to hierarchy or lack of equality. Over at Bristol University, Sirpa Crash and her colleagues also argue that by embracing colorblindness, despite evidence of pervasive forms of racism at a global scale, our universities or educational institutions not only ignore the history that links the sector to systems of racial domination, but also current ways in which our sector is implicated in reproducing those patterns. And critical race theorists in particular have critiqued these claims of neutrality by pointing out that actually color blindness is very much a part of a legacy of racial privilege that serves to dismiss and sometimes even mute experiences of people of color. Now, where I come in here is that I'm really interested in Black working class students, their experiences of completion and non-completion in higher education, and how such experiences are represented in scholarship and policy making. And as a Black working class graduate myself, I've been for a very long time intrigued by how dominant forces in these circles have constructed grand narratives that do not often align with the lived experiences of Black working class students and working class students in general, and sometimes serve to justify or explain why equity persists in and through higher education in post-apartheid South Africa. So there's two shifts that I will kind of point to, which this paper does. The first one is that whereas the research on this attainment gap has largely framed Black working class students through a flawed deficit lens, you'll find that in the literature they are referred to, non-completion is referred to as early withdrawal, early leavers, post-dropping behavior, or sometimes even referred to as working class students who choose to leave before completion. And as a result of this framing of this group of students, the Black working class students in particular are then presented as a group that needs to be filled up with idealized and often dominant forms of cultural capital. This involves attempts to remove them from familial and social contexts in an attempt to acculturate them into the university, to make them ideal students, really. But of course, this approach not only reduces failure and success to the individual student, it also in many ways exonerates the university from any contribution to the attainment gap itself. And so moving away from this outlook, as part of my doctoral thesis, I examined the counter narratives of financial aid-funded Black working class students, graduates and dropouts, as well as academic and support staff at two traditionally white universities and one traditionally Black university in South Africa. And I really sought to explore how they make sense of institutional contexts in which Black working class students are expected to aspire, navigate, and hopefully succeed. So guided by Jackson and Moore, I set out to instead examine what is wrong with the South African field of university education and its interaction with Black working class students, rather than examining what is wrong with Black working class students and their interaction with the South African field of higher education. And this is inspired by Carmen Mill's argument that by looking beyond what students lack or possess, we reassert a place for context and in our understanding of the attainment gap. But importantly, we minimize the decontextualization of educational research. So I employed a qualitative research narrative approach away from the largely statistical evidence that is employed in this particular problem to join a growing body of researchers who place at the forefront the voice and lived experiences of the unheard as valid, valuable, and critical in theorizing persistent inequality in and through higher education. As the American scholar Gloria Ladson-Billing reminds us, we often have a lot of data or a lot of facts about the extent of racial and even class inequality, but very little in the way of context, which will help us make real sense of those facts or statistics. So as a way, theoretically, I then draw from critical race theory, which provides a very powerful and widely applied tool for understanding how racial inequality and other forms of subordination are sustained in and through our institutions. But as a framework, it's very broad. It stands on a number of ideas And so I only really focus on two of them, which is the idea of interest convergence and the importance of counter narratives. And starting with interest convergence, Derek Bell, who is considered, one of the forefathers really of CRT, captured the essence of this term or concept when he said, "It appears that my worst fears have been realized. We have made progress in everything, and yet nothing has changed." And it's this idea that it is possible for progress to occur without any real substantive change in power relations. And so the theory suggests that Black people and other people of color will experience gains in only and mainly when their interests converge and not infringe on the interests of those in dominant positions or positions of power. But importantly, this often happens without much left in place to ensure real change, particularly when those interests no longer converge. And I can't think of a better place to deal with this or to examine this than South Africa. Importantly, this is where a legacy of apartheid and colonial legacy of racial inequality lives on in and outside of higher education. But importantly, given the acceleration of disparities or inequality around the world, my country can be seen to be an extreme version of global patterns, and then hopefully offer insights for the rest of the world or other countries that may be facing similar disparities. Another reason why I thought South Africa makes an ideal case for this is that due to increased financial aid, Black students have gone from being a mere 25% of students in 1980 to over 80% of the student population today. And so this demographic shakeup has led some to suggest the emergence of a post-apartheid South African meritocracy that does not and should not see color. Vice chancellors in particular point to multiracial campuses as evidence of a transforming sector. Now, I will argue, however, drawing on the theory of interest convergence and the in-depth narrative interviews in this study, I will argue that instead of transforming, under the neoliberal repurposing of South African higher education, interests have merely converged, the illusion of transformation has prevailed, and the neoliberal meritocracy and colorblindness principles are having the same adverse effects in efforts to achieve equity in higher education as they have had on the post-apartheid economy and society in general. And I just want to qualify that statement briefly. As Black economic empowerment quotas were required for lucrative state contracts, the interests of white captains of industry, that is, to qualify for these contracts, simply converged with the interests of an emerging Black elite which sought to become CEOs and minority shareholders in those companies without tampering with the colonial character of the South African economy. And as it's always the case, where interests merely converge without any real commitment to systemic change, white minority ownership and control of the South African economy was actually reinforced and not transformed in any meaningful way. And to qualify this, almost 3 decades since apartheid was outlawed, we are sitting with 86% of the wealth in the hands of the top 10%. But perhaps more importantly, the second part of the argument to be placed here is that participants' narrative accounts in this study suggest that as Black working class students' interests merely, that is, to access the panacea that is higher education, merely converge with universities' post-apartheid interests, that is subsidy, tuition fee, their image, and importantly, equality quotas. The subordination of this group of students has persisted to the detriment of institutional transformation, equity, and redress, which happen to be the core objectives of, or at least on paper, of post-apartheid higher education. And so I will now move to the illustrative excerpts that come from the counter narratives that I was able to collect during this study. Firstly, is that South Africa is divided between what was then traditionally white-only universities and traditionally black-only universities. And the first thing that comes out just by observing South African higher education is that traditionally white universities have maintained their status as highly sought after ivory towers, while traditionally black universities remain subordinate or maintain their subordinate status. The former not only takes the lion's share of the higher education budget and resources, they also inherited endowments and a status that places their graduates miles ahead of those in traditionally black universities. And this unequal distribution of resources between the two categories was particularly stressed by a professor at the traditionally black university, one of the three case study universities, who decried that in his institutions, this group of students are not getting the best out of the university due to the apartheid era-like gross underfunding of black universities. And I just want to put his words there so that when I read them, you can also see. But he says something which shouldn't be said almost 30 years after apartheid. But he says, for example, I go to class to teach. I've prepared some slides to show students, to show them a short movie, a short cartoon to maybe bring home a principle. I get there and the plugs are not working. I call maintenance and nobody picks up the phone. And for me, if a teacher cannot teach, that should be an emergency. But nobody shows up, you know. This leads to students not getting the best out of the university. And let's assume these students have deficiencies. They are here for us to form them up. For example, I was head of a department, but we didn't have a proper lab space for the department. So I needed to borrow lab space from other biological sciences department, you know, to set up practices. And his concerns were echoed by graduates from that particular university, with one graduate calling out these massive infrastructural differences between the two categories of universities. And she recalled how it was not uncommon in a campus of 16,000 students to find only one functional printer in the library. And another student said in order for him to be safe while accessing university facilities, he decided to squat. And the image I showed you before is the difference between two types of accommodation. And you see 3 mattresses on the left there, and that's a picture from this specific university where students have to squat in quite problematic, uninhabitable, conditions compared to what's on the left, or rather on your right. And it's just an illustration of this deeply unequal learning context that I'm referring to. It was therefore not surprising for me that nearly all the graduates I interviewed at that university had that university as their second, if not third, preferred institution, and only ended up there after being rejected by traditionally white universities, which are more competitive in their entrance requirements. Secondly, increased racial diversity has not been accompanied by increased class diversity in the type of university that is accessed. And so behind this veil of diversity figures are stark intersectional inequalities, with Black working class students grossly underrepresented in traditionally white universities. And the first graph on your left shows the representation of financial aid funded students in different types of university. Now, financial aid is not only the primary means through which the working class access university, but nearly 100% of them are actually Black. And so in South Africa, it's very easy, with a few exceptions, to recognize Black and working class as two sides of the same subordinated coin. This thing repeats itself in graduation patterns, where financial aid funded Black working class students remain a minority in those in the elite universities. The second finding worth stressing is that traditionally both students and academic and support staff found traditionally white universities alienating in ways taken for granted. And one professor singled out the perceived universal accessibility of language and certain styles of communication to all students as an example of how such alienation takes place. And drawing from her classroom experience, she says, if I give an example, there was a reading that I prescribed for my students. And for me, it was such a basic reading. It should have been accessible to everyone. What I took for granted was that in the reading, the author tends to use to speak through metaphors. And again, it was metaphors that I took for granted. But if you're not from a culture that engages those metaphors, mind you, already you are trying to engage the reading in terms of a different language. So it's multiple layers of access that you need just to engage that reading. So for me, that's why I'm saying the alienation cuts across different levels that we often take for granted. And so if that builds up, it leads to a sense of disconnection, and students slowly begin to disidentify. And in another traditionally white university just down the road, another academic felt that these universities needed to transform the face and character of academic staff. And he said, I think the thing that really stood out was the fact that it is important for students to have somebody that they can look up to who looks like them. And I'll give you an example. When I was at Ivory Tower University, which is one of the universities I'm referring to, all Black students, when they had problems, they came to me at the Department of Electrical Engineering. And by the way, they have not replaced me since I left. They still don't have a Black South African professor. But secondly, do our professors actually take it as their responsibility or role to be able to give confidence to these students? I think we are untransformed, unkind, and quite harsh. I'm really spending time on these narratives to use them as a way of communicating the arguments made on the previous slides. And graduates at the same universities echoed these views, but they narrated encounters with academic staff who they deemed simply out of touch with the realities of working class students. The last theme is this illusion of transformation. It was really recurrent across both graduates and academic and support staff that South African universities are actually window dressing, behind which lies practices and cultures that hinder Black working class prospects and odds of completion. And one such practice was pushed dropouts. Now, in much of the European literature that I've consulted, even in the UK, as I said earlier, the attainment gap is focused on what they call voluntary withdrawal from university. But push dropouts is basically when the university or the faculty unilaterally decides to discontinue or deregister a student in the name of poor performance. And so what came out of these narrative accounts, it really shows how these participants see that practice as part and parcel of how the university has decided to relate to this group of students. That is only when the interests of the two converge. And one professor says, for me, push dropouts presupposes certain things. It presupposes that this person is not teachable. That is the bottom line. And then the question becomes, who is not teachable? It presupposes that we've done everything we can as an institution to teach. And when have we ever done that? But funny enough, even this exclusion thing is violence. It is symbolic violence that results in real violence. I mean, we are conferring an identity on this person that you are not teachable. And by conferring that identity, you are sentencing them to something, to a life where they are not able to then meet the standards of the very market society we exist in. And she proceeded to say, here we are talking, we are window dressing. Even though she can't speak for all universities, But in her university, which is one of the traditionally white universities, she believes we have jumped on the bandwagon of decolonization and whatnot. But the way we have done it is that we are starting with the assumption that the foundation is not a problem. Who is this person? Audre Lorde, who says you cannot rebuild the house with the master's tools. You need new tools. And what transformation looks like here is that we are trying to rebuild with the same tools. Another member of the support staff was more cautious, but did say that I think we are transforming very slowly. And I think we're doing it, in my personal view, just to meet certain quotas. A classic case of interest convergence, really. One example from a graduate from the same university was that we have oversimplified poor people not doing well. That is my personal opinion. We have oversimplified it. We tend to think poor people are stupid, right? Poor people are not stupid. Poor people are aware of very hectic dynamics that rich people are too privileged and are privileged not to think about. So, in conclusion, I'm jumping a few more narratives in light of time, but I think the point has been made. Participants in this study suggest that our renewed pursuit for racial justice in education and society ought to move beyond the veil of diversity policies and numbers towards transforming institutions themselves and Black people's experiences in them. And to achieve this, a clear distinction must be made between institutional transformation, that is, ending cultures and practices that structurally harm the prospects of Black students and other students of color, and normalizing their subordination. So a distinction must be made between that and circumstances where their interests merely converge with the interests of those in dominant position. And instead of aiding to transform these students into ideal students, what Sarah O'Shea calls the manufacturing of sameness, educational research should instead strive to make explicit and transform institutional levers through which our universities hinder these experiences and then produce outcomes which are detrimental to the already marginalized. And so in this paper, I join those who challenge the very idea that the same principles of neoliberal meritocracy and colorblindness that have resulted in record levels of inequality, whether across the Atlantic or across the English Channel or here in South Africa, can somehow achieve less or rather just and equitable outcomes when applied to the field of university education. And I feel this work is important in informing young working class youth who are preparing to go to university to at least have an idea of the sort of environment they will find themselves in, but also to better prepare themselves and maybe even realign their expectations. And to end with one of the quotes, which I will not read the entire quote because of time. To conclude, one professor said that she thinks universities reward the wrong things. So our assessments needs to change. I think our engagements need to change. I think we need to be careful about the values that are in our curriculum, the unspoken values, and the curriculum that we take for granted. I think when we assess students, we are not just assessing how much they've memorized the contents. We are also assessing them, how well they're able to reproduce it in a language that we want. I think we take for granted that our pedagogy is not just the readings we prescribe. Our pedagogy is also the values that we promote. I'll pause there and really thank you once again for the opportunity. This is part of a paper that I'll be submitting to Critical Studies in Education in the next week or two, and so I'll welcome all comments. Will be highly welcomed, whether now or in written form, so that I can improve it further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mukovhe. I'm sure we've all really enjoyed and found inspiring your presentation. I can think of a question, but let me open up the floor to everyone. So does anybody have a question for Mukovhe or any comments? Maybe while people are thinking, I'll ask my question. And I know it's not at the heart of what you're studying, I think, but I noticed that two of your participants mentioned the importance of language. One talked about the metaphors, and then in your last quote there, I mean, I'm sure we all couldn't agree more that at the heart of it seems to be training students to use the right language rather than the content or the values. And I was just wondering to what extent or to what degree your participants mentioned that. Was that just in those two quotes, or was that a big issue for your participants?
Thank you. That's a very important question. In fact, to give a bit of background, I was looking at school living results of the 2020 academic year, and if we take one of the elite universities where they run points requirements as well as subject requirements as part of the admission criteria, you could filter mainly rural and black provinces out of that institution by simply checking how many matriculants passed English with more than 65%, which is the required. And so English alone, it's such a big issue, not just as a language itself, but how it's so valued in students' experiences in higher education, but also just as a gatekeeping kind of criteria or part of the criteria. It came up quite often in the traditionally black universities where because the participants knew I spoke the language, when they wanted to drive home things that really irritated them about the experience, they would even say, can I just say this in my language so you understand what I'm saying? I also faced challenges because of my role as the previous student union president. Most participants, I had to almost extract some of these narratives out of them because they would preface their sentences with, as you would know, we think this is what is truly happening. And I would have to ask them to assume that I didn't know so that I can capture the true extent of how they perceive these experiences. So language came out quite a lot across the three universities, including those working class students in elite institutions where English plays many roles as a language, whether in determining whether one is confident enough to speak in class or to confront the lecturer for more clarity, or in just understanding the material that's been prescribed. So it was a very big issue actually.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm sure many of us who have a language background find that very interesting. Okay, any other questions for Mukovhe? Oh, you've just muted yourself again, Myron.
Sharon had her hand up.
Oh, did you? Sorry, Sharon, I didn't see that. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating presentation. I had two questions. One was, have you presented your findings to university managers or policymakers in South Africa or professors? And if so, what has the response been? And then my other question was, are there any examples of initiatives that in any of the elite universities or any in the sector at all that give you the hope that there is work going on that could be built on?
Okay, thank you. Both those questions are very important and helpful. I'll start with the first one. Rather your last question and then go back to the first one. So there's a lot of these first year experience programs across most universities. They're almost like becoming this tick box thing that every student development division claims to have a first year experience. Now the first year experience could achieve a lot if it was not designed to acculturate, as Sarah Sher says, if it's designed to bridge some of the preliminary transitional issues that this group of students faces, it could certainly have a lot, offer a lot towards efforts to reduce the attainment gap, primarily because the dropout rate, if I may call it that for now, happens a lot in the first year of study, and then kind of stabilizes in latter years of the degrees, the different degrees. So those efforts are there, but the other efforts that really point to a hopeful direction is the kind of conversations that are going on. As you know, higher education in South Africa is very politicized. It's been a subject of politics pre and post-apartheid era. And so there's a lot of discussions among the student population on how to rethink and reimagine what the university means to them, and to realign the power relations. You would be familiar with the Fees Must Fall protests, for example. Sorry. During those protests, senior student leaders like myself were asked to kind of jump the university and take these struggles to a government level, so that we change the policy at a state level. And funny enough, that gave university managers a very much needed confidence to also now raise their voice towards government, because in many ways they used to just cooperate and maintain kind of normalcy. And I found that the splitting of effort, where we sought to decommodify at a national policy level, while and us a lot of allies from within the university, because the heavy lifting was now being done by the students, either in the streets or some of ourselves in the policy making boardrooms. And so that's just another example of how the conversation is moving in a way that I think points to a possibly a positive future moving forward. This specific, to go to the first question, this specific paper, because it's coming out of my PhD, immediately after the PhD, I became a parent, so I stopped doing a lot of work and really just moved inward. So I've been doing a lot of writing and parenting simultaneously. But when recently the finance minister cut a budget of about 6 billion rands from the financial aid scheme as part of the austerity drive on which COVID is being used as a justification, and that immediately led to protests. And when it did, from Orowa, I was called by some of the leadership of the country to say, hey, come and fix your nightmare here at home, because your constituency is revolting again. Now, it was easy for me to simply point them to some of the documentation we had prepared for them before. And so, in a way, transformation and this drive towards equity in South Africa has its beneficiaries as the foremost security guards. In other words, students are always the first ones to stand up and stop any drive towards the disintegration of some of the benefits we may have already acquired. So that's the extent to which I've presented this work. It was in, I've done some work as a manager of South Africa's governing party policy at the party. So it is in those bases that they contacted me to produce this brief. I'm looking forward to presenting this at my university in the next couple of weeks, as well as a seminar series that I will be doing with student leaders and academics online as well. So that's how far I've gone with it. I'm sure you can hear in the background my daughter screaming. So I have to split this time between those two roles.
I can't hear her, but congratulations on being a parent. And look, good luck when you present in your seminar series.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck from me as well. Let's just take 2 more minutes. Hilary, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, I had my hand up. Mukovhe, thank you. That was really interesting. Obviously, we've worked together on one of your bids, so it's really interesting to listen to your presentation. It was just a question about merger universities. Obviously, you've investigated the traditionally black and the traditionally white. Where do the merger universities sit?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, because in fact, in the thesis, my original thinking categorized the South African universities into 3 tiers: traditionally black, traditionally white, and the mergers that you refer to. And I had this debate with myself whether should I call a university, because the mergering that happened was more of the traditionally white university swallowing the small scale traditionally black university. And so one of the institutions that I actually did work in is a traditionally white university that has turned into a merger. And it would be interesting with what going forward for me to look at whether there are any real differences at an institutional culture, at an institutional practices between traditionally white universities that did not merge and traditionally white universities that merged with small-scale traditionally black universities, which were mainly technicons. But I must say that based on the doctoral work that I did, there is definitely a difference. Mergers seem to go out of their way to show how different they are from their former self, whereas traditional, the ones that did not merge have really not only maintained their status, but they dangle that status as a prize for which everyone must battle towards. And I think your question is even more important, because when you look at the caliber of students who end up at which universities. So the university I went to is one of the most highly contested, and if there are a 500,000 matriculants who wrote matric, it will only take 6,000 of that, and that 6,000 comes from the very top of South African high schools, mainly even private high schools for that matter. And so that's why when you drill down in beyond the blackness of the student population, you get to see even more divisions within the student population, and as a result, differentiated experiences amongst the very black student population. So yes, there is definitely a difference. I just didn't want to overemphasize it in this paper, because I'm still battling or debating it in my mind whether to give it a designated identity as the merger, as I did in the doctoral thesis, or really just refer to it as a traditionally white university that merged with a small-scale traditionally black university. But thank you. I think that's a very important point you picked up.
Thank you, Mukovhe. Once again, thank you. We've all really enjoyed your very nuanced and really inspiring paper. So thank you for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have our lunch break now. We'll meet again at 2:15, and I look forward to seeing you all there later on. So I hope you enjoy your lunch break. See you later.